We continue our study in the Book of Judges. This week we've come on to Samson, the most famous judge of all, or the most infamous judge of all. If we read children's stories about Samson, we discover really that he is portrayed as a 21st century Superman who's given extreme powers to conquer his enemies. And the children's books, portray Samson as this dynamic man who's fighting for God's people during a difficult time of Israel's history. If you read the Bible in this way, like you do the children's stories of Samson, you can miss the whole point of what the author of Judges is trying to communicate to you through these stories and narratives. You know, we could be misled in believing that the Ophel or Gideon are people we should inspire to be like Samson. Some of these characters may have bright moments, but mostly they are not good leaders, and they lead their people tragically into worse periods of sin. And that's what they are, flawed leaders. And that's what the Book of Judges is trying to portray. Now, remember, we've talked about the structure of Judges, and just a reminder that the structure of Judges is so important in these stories. We need to understand that this cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance and peace oversees this whole period of a couple of hundred years in the history of God's people, Israel. These judges are widely different. Some may be good, pretty good, okay, but many are bad and terrible. And so we come to Samson, who we could describe as promiscuous, violent, and arrogant. So what has this got to teach us today? Well, it's got lots to teach us. Last week we looked at the story of Jephthah and his reign, how it affected his daughter and condemned her to a life of loneliness because of a wild vow he made. And so that story teaches us very much is that we shouldn't make vows to God lightly, because if we don't keep them, there are going to be consequences. So we move on to Samson this week. So we start off by listening to the story in Judges 13.
Judges chapter 13. Once again, the Israelites started disobeying the Lord, so he let the Philistines take control of Israel for 40 years. Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was not able to have children, but one day an angel from the Lord appeared to her and said,
"You have never been able to have any children, but very soon you will be pregnant and have a son. He will belong to God from the day he is born. So his hair must never be cut. And even before he is born, you must not drink any wine or beer or eat any food forbidden by God's laws.
Your son will begin to set Israel free from the Philistines," the angel said. She went to Manoah and said,
"A prophet who looked like an angel of God came and talked to me. I was so frightened that I didn't even ask where he was from. He didn't tell me his name, but he did say that I'm going to have a baby boy. I'm not supposed to drink any wine or beer or eat any food forbidden by God's laws. Our son will belong to God for as long as he lives."
Then Manoah prayed,
Our Lord, please send that prophet again and let him tell us what to do for the son we are going to have.
God answered Manoah's prayer, and the angel went back to Manoah's wife while she was resting in the fields. Manoah wasn't there at the time, so she found him and said,
That same man is here again. He's the one I saw the other day.
Manoah went with his wife and asked the man.
Are you the one who spoke to my wife?
Yes, I am,
he answered. Manoah then asked,
When your promise comes true, what rules must he obey and what will be his work?
Your wife must be careful to do everything I told her.
The Lord's angel answered.
She must not eat or drink anything made from grapes. She must not drink wine or beer or eat anything forbidden by God's laws. I told her exactly what to do.
Please,
Manoah said,
stay here with us for just a little while, and we'll fix a young goat for you to eat.
Manoah didn't realize that he was really talking to one of the Lord's angels. The angel answered,
I can stay for a little while, although I won't eat any of your food. But if you would like to offer the goat as a sacrifice to the Lord, that would be fine.
Manoah said,
Tell us your name so we can honor you after our son is born.
No,
the angel replied.
You don't need to know my name. And if you did, you couldn't understand it.
So Manoah took a young goat over to a large rock he had chosen for an altar, and he built a fire on the rock. Then he killed the goat and offered it with some grain as a sacrifice to the Lord. But then an amazing thing happened. The fire blazed up toward the sky, and the Lord's angel went up toward heaven in the fire. Manoah and his wife bowed down low when they saw what happened. The angel was gone, but Manoah and his wife realized that he was one of the Lord's angels. Manoah said,
We have seen an angel. Now we are going to die.
The Lord isn't going to kill us.
Manoah's wife responded.
The Lord accepted our sacrifice and grain offering, and he let us see something amazing. Besides, he told us that we're going to have a son.
Later, Manoah's wife did give birth to a son, and she named him Samson. As the boy grew, the Lord blessed him. Then, while Samson was staying at Dan's camp between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol, the Spirit of the Lord took control of him.
So from the reading we held just a few minutes ago, we can see that Samson was a special child, born because God intervened into the lives of the Israelite people. Because God's people were always expecting special births right from the beginning of time, someone to overcome the sin that entered the world at the beginning of the story in Genesis. And so that's why the Bible features 7 important birth narratives of arrival of special people to involve God's involvement in the world. We've got the births of Isaac and Jacob that show God's faithfulness to God's people. And then the birth of Moses, then Samson, Samuel, John the Baptist, and finally Jesus. All of these special births that remind us God promised that his seed would perform great acts of salvation for his people. And these people I've mentioned on the list there on the slide all had a big part to play in the ongoing work of God's salvation in the world for his people. But of course, it's not until Jesus comes that the whole situation does something really dramatic. Samson, of course, and John the Baptist are related, not in a family sort of way, relationship sort of way, but rather in a redemptive relationship sort of way. Both their births are unique and announced by the angel of the Lord. Both of their mothers had difficulty conceiving children and were desperately praying to God for a child. And God works a miracle in their life. And both these men were designated as Nazarites. In other words, they were both appointed by God for a special, specific job in their life. Tragically, they were both betrayed by women to death. Samson by Delilah and John the Baptist by Herodias' daughter. These men served faithfully, but their main role was to point beyond themselves to a coming king. For Samson, that king was to point to David. For John the Baptist, to another son of David, Jesus Christ. So Samson and Delilah were both special people. Now, some preachers try to apply, quite wrongly, I think, that the life of Samson is somebody we can follow. Teaching if God can, use somebody like Samson, a terrible sinner and a womanizer, they can certainly use people like us to serve his church. Well, this is not true. Yes, surely none of us are quite often bad as sinners as Samson was. But the truth is, Samson was a special type of Christ. He wasn't a type of person like us. Both Samson and Jesus were saviors. We are people who need saviors. We are not saviors. And so if we want to identify with anybody in the book of Judges, Judges teaches us that we need to identify with the people of Israel who were struggling to walk in the ways of God and found it difficult and often wandered around and worshipped other things other than him. We can be shocked when we hear the in-depth story of Samson portrayed in these few chapters of Judges. But we need to remember that even when he picked up a wife that wasn't from Israel, wasn't a Jew, that there were other great leaders who married women that wasn't Jews. Boaz, for instance, Moses and Rahab all married people that wasn't of the Jewish clan. So we mustn't be too hard on Samson for wanting a non-Jewish wife. It was God's purpose. Miles van der Pelt says this: the truth is, Samson was born to kill Philistines. He was a special calling from the Lord to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines, and he was partly successful in his calling. Tragically, the way in which we think about Samson today is much like the way in which the Pharisees thought of Jesus, associating with sinful women, eating with tax collectors, and healing on the Sabbath. The Pharisees also believed that Jesus wrongly identified himself as God. So Samson was born a Nazarite. He was a special person, dedicated his whole life to God. He was to live as a Nazarite, which meant that he needed to abstain from drinking alcohol, refrain from cutting his hair, and avoid coming into contact with dead bodies. So he was special. He was one of just a few. He wasn't a person like us. God was going to use him in a special way. Now, most Nazarites we read about in the scripture and what's taught to us in Deuteronomy are the fact that this Nazarite, to become a Nazarite, was a voluntary vow that people took to live that type of life. But Samson's vow is not voluntary. He was born to that life. Of course, the other thing that's special about this is the way that the angel talks to Samson's mother and telling her that she must almost live a Nazareth type life as well, refraining from alcohol during her pregnancy. And that's quite unusual, since all the Israelites were subject to the law of some part of the Nazarite condition. So why did the angel mention it specifically to his mother? Perhaps it was because of the condition of the Jewish people as a whole in their relationship with God. Daniel Block says this: no other deliverer in the Book of Judges matches Samson's potential. Yet in spite of all these advantages and special attention, he accomplishes less on behalf of his people than any of his predecessor deliverers. In other words, judges. That's the problem. And the problem starts, we hear about Samson when he has a desire for women outside the tribe of Israel.
Judges chapter 14. One day Samson went to Timnah, where he saw a Philistine woman. When he got back home, he told his parents,
I saw a Philistine woman in Timnah, and I want to marry her. Get her for me.
His parents answered,
There are a lot of women in our clan, and even more in the rest of Israel. Those Philistines are pagans. Why would you want to marry one of their women?
She looks good to me.
Samson answered.
Get her for me.
At that time, the Philistines were in control of Israel, and the Lord wanted to stir up trouble for them. That's why he made Samson desire that woman. As Samson and his parents reached the vineyards near Timnah, a fierce young lion suddenly roared and attacked Samson. But the Lord's Spirit took control of Samson, and with his bare hands he tore the lion apart as though it had been a young goat. His parents didn't know what he had done, and he didn't tell them. When they got to Timnah, Samson talked to the woman, and he was sure that she was the one for him. Later, Samson returned to Timnah for the wedding, and when he came near the place where the lion had attacked, he left the road to see what was left of the lion. He was surprised to see that bees were living in the lion's skeleton, and that they had made some honey. He scooped up the honey in his hands and ate some of it as he walked along. When he got back to his parents, he gave them some of the honey and they ate it too. But he didn't tell them he had found the honey in the skeleton of a lion. While Samson's father went to make the final arrangements with the bride and her family, Samson threw a big party as grooms usually did. When the Philistines saw what Samson was like, they told 30 of their young men to stay with him at the party. Samson told the 30 young men,
This party will last for 7 days. Let's make a bet. I'll tell you a riddle, and if you can tell me the right answer before the party is over, I'll give each one of you a shirt and a full change of clothing. But if you can't tell me the answer, then each of you will have to give me a shirt and a full change of clothing.
It's a bet,
the Philistine said.
Tell us the riddle.
Samson said,
Once so strong and mighty, now so sweet and tasty.
3 days went by, and the Philistine young men had not come up with the right answer. Finally, on the 7th day of the party, they went to Samson's bride and said,
You had better trick your husband into telling you the answer to his riddle. Have you invited us here just to rob us? If you don't find out the answer, we will burn you and your family to death.
Samson's bride went to him and started crying in his arms.
You must really hate me.
She sobbed.
If you love me at all, you would have told me the answer to your riddle.
Oh, but I haven't even told my parents the answer,
Samson replied.
Why should I tell you?
For the entire 7 days of the party, she had been whining and trying to get the answer from him. But that 7th day, she put so much pressure on Samson that he finally gave in and told her the answer. She went straight to the young men and told them. Before sunset that day, the men of the town went to Samson with this answer.
A lion is the strongest, Honey is the sweetest.
Samson replied,
This answer you have given me doubtless came from my bride-to-be.
Then the Lord's Spirit took control of Samson. He went to Ashkelon, where he killed 30 men and took their clothing. Samson then gave it to the 30 young men at Timnah and stormed back home to his own family. The father of the bride had Samson's wife marry one of the 30 young men that had been at Samson's party.
So here's the story of Samson's wife, a girl from a local village that wasn't a Jew. He desired her and demanded of his parents to go and get her for him, as we read. Samson's demand for his parents to get him a foreign wife reveals a total disregard for authority in his life, whether parental or divine. I mean, that's pretty shocking of what he requires of his parents, really, because of his lust for this Temanite woman. The narrative suggests that Samson's sinful actions are turned by Yahweh to accomplish his will. Well, that may be true, but we've got to be careful with that, because God doesn't cause us or tempt us to sin. But of course, he can nevertheless accomplish his will through our sin, his divine will. But Samson's behavior is not one what one would expect from a Nazarite. Lawson Younger says this: from the following stories, it becomes clear that left to himself, Samson would never have become involved in God or even Israel's agenda. Left to themselves, the Israelites would have been satisfied to continue to coexist with the Philistines. But Yahweh has other plans. Samson's marriage to a Philistine causes all sorts of events to happen in the following chapters of Judges. But let's just reflect a bit on that, what we just read. Why is it mentioned in the script that Samson kills a lion with his bare hands? Well, it's quite a brave event to kill a lion. We could all imagine that we wouldn't ever attempt to do anything like that, would we? But obviously, Samson was endowed with strength to do that sort of thing. But of course, the other thing we need to notice out of that is Samson never tells his parents about the killing of this lion, or later on, where he gets the honey from. And why is that? Why does he deliberately hold that information? Well, because he's defiled himself in killing this lion. And certainly by taking honey from a dead body, animal or otherwise. As a Nazarite, he shouldn't be anywhere near dead corpses. So there's nothing wrong with Samson protecting himself, but according to the vow of a Nazarite, if someone dies suddenly in his presence, then he's got to cleanse himself from that. And that meant that Samson should have abandoned his trip to see his potential bride and to go to his wedding ceremony when he get hold of this honey from this dead corpse of a lion. He needed to cleanse himself for 7 days according to the laws of Moses. But of course, that's inconvenient for Samson, and that's why it's never mentioned. But of course, it's mentioned to us because we see the way that Samson wasn't really following in God's will. And so he goes to this marriage feast. 7 days. Well, I suppose that's not unusual for weddings to take 7 days in the ancient Near East. And of course, obviously lots of alcohol would have been consumed in this feast. We're not told whether Samson drinks of it or not, but we wouldn't put it past him, would we? But of course, this challenge is offered to him, he challenges these Philistines that have more or less, I'd imagine, sent to guard him about what he was doing when he offered them this bet about this riddle. And of course, it was a bet that he took on that he should never have lost, Samson, because they would never have guessed it, because the meeting with the lion, where he got the riddle for about being stronger and sweeter with the honey coming in with the bees, could only have been known to him. But of course, Samson, by marrying this woman, this Timonite, had put her in great danger, because she could be used by the evil Philistines. And so she's desperate to get this information out of him of what the riddle meant, because she had been threatened with death. And of course, who put her in that position? Samson did. And of course, she gets it out of him, she tells, and of course he loses his bet, and he loses his temper as well, and goes storming off and has to kill 30 other Philistines to get their clothes and tunics to pay the debt. And then he just abandons his wife. He's so upset that he loses his bet that he goes running back to his home. So 2 observations here, really, that we need to note. One, losing this bet was his own fault. If he'd kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't have lost. And the act of killing men was just anger and vengeance, straightforward theft and murder, far from a person we would think that God wanted him to act as a saviour to the Israelite people. Because Samson's choice in killing these men particularly is not to deliver Israel from the Philistines or even to bring judgment on him. It only serves his purposes to placate his own rage and anger. Samson's anger rages out of control. And so he leaves his wife, puts his wife in danger, and returns home. Then we come on to chapter 15. Sometime later, he returned to his wife, only to find out her father had been given to another.
Chapter 15. Later during the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit the young woman he thought was still his wife. He brought along a young goat as a gift and said to her father,
"I want to go into my wife's bedroom."
You can't do that,
he replied.
When you left the way you did, I thought you were divorcing her. So I arranged for her to marry one of the young men who were at your party. But my younger daughter is even prettier. And you can have her as your wife.
This time,
Samson answered,
I have a good reason for really hurting some Philistines.
Samson went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them together in pairs with oil-soaked rags around their tails. Then Samson took the foxes into the Philistine wheat fields that were ready to be harvested. He set the rags on fire and let the foxes go. The wheat fields went up in flames, and so did the stacks of wheat that had already been cut. Even the Philistine vineyards and olive orchards burned. Some of the Philistines started asking around,
"Who could have done such a thing?"
It was Samson.
Someone told them.
He married the daughter of that man in Timnah. But then the man gave Samson's wife to one of the men at the wedding.
The Philistines' leaders went to Timnah and burned to death Samson's wife and her father. When Samson found out what they had done, he went to them and said,
You killed them, and I won't rest until I get even with you.
Then Samson started hacking them to pieces with his sword. Samson left Philistia and went to live in the cave at Etam Rock. But it wasn't long before the Philistines invaded Judah and set up a huge army camp at Jawbone. The people of Judah asked,
"Why have you invaded our land?"
The Philistines answered,
"We've come to get Samson. We're going to do the same things to him that he did to our people."
3,000 men from Judah went to the cave at Etam Rock and said to Samson,
"Don't you know that the Philistines rule us and they will punish us for what you did?"
I was only getting even with them.
Samson replied.
They did the same things to me first.
So Samson has caused so much trouble that the Philistines have raised an army and invaded Judah and threatened the Judeans. So the Judeans in turn on Samson himself to give himself up to save themselves. So Samson has caused an absolute horrendous problems in Judah because of his loss of temper and loss of control. So we'll continue the story next week when we'll look at Samson and Delilah.